What actually goes into making a roller coaster realistic? Because in Planet Coaster, it's easy to build something that looks insane, but would never be allowed to operate in real life. So today we're doing something completely different from the usual. Today we're taking a real park and giving ourselves a hypothetical $20 million budget to create the park's new premier attraction. In doing this, we're going to consider real engineering constraints and real-life safety standards while attempting to design a roller coaster that could theoretically actually exist. From G-force limitations to safety clearances and even return on investment for the park, today we're going to try and replicate all the work that goes into creating our favorite thrill-seeking machines in Planet Coaster 2. Hello everyone, welcome back to TH Designs. Today we are heading back to our roller coaster designing roots. In honor of the newly released Update 9 and specifically the new addition of track types and styles on different models, today we are going to attempt to recreate a realistic coaster building process. We're going to be including a real park, a simulated project brief, and realistic constraints and parameters, all the way to engineering code, throughput, maintenance bays, etc., and trying to make it the least nerdy as possible. Before we do dive into this video, understand that I am not an engineer. I don't really have much experience at all with this besides riding these rides. I'm not a park planner or anything adjacent. I just simply design rides in a video game. But I thought this was a really good chance to do a fun exercise, diving into an area of Planet Coaster and overall coaster designing in simulation that is relatively untouched. So I'm going to do my very best to try and keep it realistic. I'm absolutely positive there's going to be things I miss. Before we build a coaster, we are going to need a park, and in this case, a real-life park. Theoretically, a park that is in dire need of a new addition that we can fulfill. And while many parks definitely come to mind, one in particular comes to mind as my local park, and that is Dorney Park. Nestled in the heart of Allentown, Pennsylvania, Dorney Park and Wildwater Kingdom is one of America's oldest continuously operating amusement parks, dating all the way back to 1884. What started as a relatively simple and modest park has evolved into a full-scale thrill destination, now home to over 60 rides, including iconic coasters like its marquee, Steel Force. And as of late, the park's newest attraction as of 2024, Iron Menace. Located right in the middle and the heart of the tri-state area, Dorney Park has plenty of competition with surrounding parks such as Six Flags Great Adventure or Hershey Park. But with those hurdles, the park has put in a lot of effort as of late to try and compete with its competitors. Today we're going to help develop the park even more and give it one more marquee attraction in the most realistic fashion that we can in Planet Coaster 2. And in order for us to create a conceptual proposal, we have to start with a project brief, which, as you can see, I kind of threw one together real quick. Of course, project briefs look nothing like this. This is way nicer than the typical one you'd see. There's also a lot less information on it. You can see everything from the budget that we have, which is $20 million, which is relatively fair for a mid-sized premier attraction. Take Iron Menace, for example. That was about $15 million. Like I said, there's a lot going on this page. Let's jump to the brief that just highlights the stuff that's really important to us. And that's this guy here with all the red highlights. $20 million budget, as I mentioned, and the key goal that we really want to focus on that Dorney Park wants is a family to mid thrill attraction. The ride requirements is where a lot of our constraints lie. Dorney Park is looking for something between 60 and 90 seconds in duration, 30 to 60 miles per hour with a launch mechanism specifically, so we're going to be working with a launch coaster here. Relative to maintenance and engineering, we want an accessible maintenance area. We want to make sure that we're not touching any maintenance and accessibility roads, both for construction and for later park staff. And then the site details, as you see on the right here, we are working adjacent to Steel Force in this very large property of land that used to be Dinosaurs Alive. If we jump over here to Google Earth, you get the entire park in scale, and you can see just how much room we have to work with. Are we going to use all of this? Absolutely not. We have 8.59 acres of space here. That's huge. Just for reference, Steel Force is just north of it right there. And then Iron Menace is actually right here, but this image was before Iron Menace was completed. This used to be where Stinger used to sit as well. Dorney Park wants more guests to spend some more time in what is the more thrilling section of the park, but with this very divided pathing scheme, the guest circulation patterns are a little skewed, and that's where our attraction comes in. Not only are we in charge of creating a brand new thrilling attraction, we are in charge of satisfying the current guest circulation patterns to make sure that these facilities and utilities are getting a little bit more attention in comparison to some of the other coasters, which are smack dab in the middle of the entire park layout. Now to do this, of course, we're going to need an in-game park, which is where this recreation of Dorney Park comes in, which was done by Matty Park. It has the brand new Iron Menace, Possessed, and Steel Force by extension, and you can see these red walls here are our park boundaries. This is how much room we have to build our new attraction, which is plenty of space. I am using the brand new updated version of Planet Coaster, which is where you see this entertainment tab. I'm going to quickly mention this because I'm very grateful for Frontier sharing this with me. But what has inspired this episode specifically is the addition of new track types. If we come over here to the B&M coaster, you can see we no longer have just this thin spine. We can also now have a thick spine, which is finally a great addition that's been added to the game. And speaking of coaster models, we need to choose one of these that we feel best fits our proposal. Looking back at the brief, remember we have a $20 million budget, but only like 60 to 75% of that is going to actually go towards the ride layout. The other 30 or so percent goes towards terraforming, the repathing around it, the theming, the electronics, and all of the ride features. So really we're designing a coaster more with the realm of 15, maybe $12 million of budget. So that takes away a lot of really good models. Dorney Park also is really concerned with high capacity and throughput intervals and high reliability. And the two manufacturers that come to mind are Mack Rides and then second B&M. This gives us 15 different coaster models to choose from, some more realistic than others. We're not doing a water coaster here, sorry. And Dorney Park already has a dive coaster, already has a floorless coaster, already has a B&M invert. And as much as I would like to do a mock coaster, I am doing this video in celebration of the new update, and one of the features in the new update that I didn't mention is the addition of the Wing Coaster LSM launch. Dorney does want a launch coaster, so this kind of satisfies all angles. Is it the highest capacity? Is it the most reliable? Maybe, maybe not. There's plenty of B&Ms in Dorney Park, so they have a good relationship with them. I imagine this Wing Coaster being somewhat similar to Rapterra, which just opened at King's Dominion. Although that was a $30 million installment, we have a little bit less of a budget than they do. So maybe not the size of that, maybe something a little bit closer to Mandrill Mayhem, or some of the new Legoland Wing Coasters that we're seeing open up as well. The launch Wing Coaster has been very active as of late as a model, so why not by extension include one in the park that only really has one launch coaster, and albeit it's an out and back shuttle coaster. Now the nice thing is about this plot of land is that it is relatively flat. I didn't look at any topographical maps of what it looks like in real life, because it wouldn't be the most relevant because we are recreating this in Planet Coaster, so really all that matters is what the terraforming in this looks like. All we can see is that there's a higher elevation of terrain over here on the western corner. Other than that, it's relatively flat, which would help a lot with our budget, especially when it comes to making the station, the foundations themselves, all the supports. We're starting to approach the actual layout of the coaster itself, but before we do anything, we have to make sure that we have the station in a location that supports the guest circulation patterns, which I wish I could have some kind of heat map or so, but really the hotspots are here by Steel Force, kind of in this transition over to Thunderhawk, and then over here by Possessed and Iron Menace. Less so over here, which is where the station of Iron Menace is, as well as the Cedar Creek Wing Gliders, I think is what that's called. We have a chance to continue this path where Dinosaurs Alive used to be. That's what this little piece of path is. I think we have a chance to actually bridge it over the little creek to make these less of dead ends and more of an actual loop. Now that means that we are going to need more path, more foundation, more terraforming, and that's going to eat out our budget a little bit more. So maybe at the cost of that, we have to make a smaller layout than usual. But I think it's a trade-off that is appreciated because there's very little activity that happens back here. There's just nothing else to really do around there. Something along those lines. That's not what the final path network is going to look like by any means, but it does kind of introduce us to our first layout decision, which is, do you put the station in this little crevice here that this path makes, or do you put it on the other side and more utilize some circulation and extend it to the open plot of land that's happening over here, if that makes sense. If we put this here, there's a lot less activity happening over here for things like food or drinks or midway games or whatever, or a potential flat ride that they might add in the future. It also gets very congested with Revolution over here. Secondly, Dorney Park has plenty of access roads wrapping around this side of the park, connecting all the way to some of the utility buildings happening over here by Possessed and Iron Menace. So if we build the coaster closer to this edge of the perimeter, we are also promoting very easy access for the actual track itself, all the construction workers. So my original thought was to actually place the train here and have it going towards Revolution to have a very interactive type of top hat moment. But that kind of interferes with the design problem, which is sightlines. You don't want to be standing here and losing any scope of what's happening beyond this very large structure, which would theoretically be here. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to put the top hat actually facing probably that back corner so that the guests can see it and want to go there. And then the track weaves in and out and interacts with the path with a lot of really nice interactive moments, heading into a brake run which can head this way. But now we're at a point where we have to talk about the elements of the ride itself. So like we've been talking about, $20 million budget with family to mid thrills, so we don't want anything too crazy, and we're probably going to be hanging around a 50-mile-per-hour launch. If we look over here at Rapterra, which is probably the biggest reference that we have, although it's not going to be at the scale of this because this was again $30 million, you can see that top hat happening here, as well as lots of S-bends, an Immelmann in the back there, some zero-G rolls and corkscrews. You see some corkscrews, you see some helixes, you see some more S-bends, and then you see an inline twist. These are definitely the types of layout features that we want. So of all the elements we have to choose from in a typical coaster layout building process, I would say that these 9 are the ones that wouldn't be super unusual to have on a wing coaster. We have an overbank turn, which you see on Rapterra. This is definitely a welcome element, especially for that turnaround element I've been referring to. Corkscrew, inline twist, and helix are definitely more on the modest side, definitely not unusual to see on a coaster like this. Vertical loop, even by extension, may not be the weirdest thing to see. Those exist on some wing coasters, although maybe the more thrilling ones. A zero-G roll, which I believe is on Rapterra. If not, I've definitely seen it on some wing coasters. Again, potentially too thrilling. An Immelmann, where we start from the bottom and basically turn back. I know Rapterra has one of those. An inverted top hat in the back here. Potentially a little too thrilling for this coaster, but an alternative to the overbank turn for that turnaround I've been mentioning. And then last, we have a dive loop where you just dive. And of all of these, I think we can pick reasonably 5 or 6 to have. That's about what Rapterra has, maybe a little bit less. Because I think we want to focus primarily on S-bends for something that is probably going to lean a little bit more towards family than a coaster like Rapterra does. So for the final layout of the coaster, I decided to do a 54-mile-per-hour launch that stretches about 100 feet or so. Again, we'll check the code later, make sure everything lines up, but that heads into an overbank turn, very similar to what you're seeing on Rapterra at King's Dominion. Then we have a very interesting moment. We're actually going subterranean to have a very interactive moment with the pathway. Emerging from that, we then go into a switch up. I don't know what the actual proper term for this element is. Leaving that, we then head into a corkscrew, which interacts with the very entrance to this little area, if you will. Another interactive moment, heading into an upward helix, almost borderline airtime hill, heading straight downwards into basically a mirror image of the last one, except there is an overbank section at the top of this hill, giving some more unique airtime, heading into another partially subterranean element, which is an Immelmann. That Immelmann exits to its left and then banks slowly upwards into an inline twist, which will again interact with the pathing into the brake run, which again, we'll have to check, make sure everything's code compliant, but we do have enough runoff for a maintenance bay at the very least. This is where most Planet Coaster builds would end when it comes to the layout and the actual coaster design. But for us in this video, this is just the beginning. Now we kind of have to proofread and code check pretty much every single element of this coaster and make sure it fits primarily to ASTM code. ASTM is the industry standard safety guidelines used for the design, manufacture, operation, maintenance, and inspection of amusement rides. There's a fantastic video done by Coaster College on YouTube, and it's called Rules for Ride Design. I may even clip it in this video to describe some of the things that I will be talking about in this next portion of the video. But specifically, we are going to be talking about ASTM F2291, which primarily covers G-forces, clearances, and restraints. So the first one of those that we are going to talk about is G-forces. We need to make sure that this wing coaster is fitting the ASTM guidelines for G-forces. It's less about the actual maximums of the G-forces and more about the transitions between them. Essentially, there has to be more than 200 milliseconds between large G-force variations. So basically that means you can't go one direction and snap the other direction in a very small window. That rule doesn't pertain too much to this because, like I said, this isn't a very thrilling coaster, so it's not pulling many G-forces. The verticals we want to be around 3.5 to 4.5, and then the negative, otherwise the airtime G-forces, to be no more than negative 0.5 to negative 1.5. Longitudinal, which is the launch ones, we don't want to break 2. Ideally, we want to stay around 1. And as the coaster reaches the end of its layout, we will now have all the results. So first of all, that's what all the stats look like. 5.24 excitement, 3.12 fear, 0.69 nausea. So not the most exciting stats in the world, but that's just kind of Planet Coaster calculating this. But anyway, what we're interested in are the G-force stats here. Max lateral G-force, we mentioned, doesn't want to be over 1.5. We are at a max of 1.32, so that's actually spot on. Max vertical G-force, we don't want to break 4.5. We're at 3.5. We're actually on the lower end of the G-forces, which is definitely leaning towards that family side. A minimum is negative 1.08, which is pretty much smack in the middle of negative 0.5 to negative 1.5. And then a max forward of 1.15. That's okay. We're in that range of 1 to 2. So this actually doesn't need that much adjusting, surprisingly. Typically I'm guilty of having excessive vertical G-forces, but this coaster is actually pretty smooth. It passes ASTM's G-force range. Clearances is another piece of the F2291 for ASTM guidelines, which states that you have to assume the 95th percentile of rider dimensions with a 3-inch extension including arms and leg reach. This kind of idea is called the Patron clearance envelope. You are a coaster enthusiast, you probably have seen this contraption here, basically guaranteeing that nothing interacts with the riders. Now, we don't have that issue here because we don't have such intimate theming as seen at parks like Disney or Universal, but essentially the rule would typically be 3 to 4 feet from your rider. Now, we are a wing coaster, so it will be kind of tight. If anything, once we develop this tunnel as well as that little subterranean moment there, we may have to check it out, make sure that we're good. As for walkways, which does matter to us, ASTM states that it has to be 10 to 15 feet above walkways with a net above any occupied paths. That includes also staff path. So there will have to be a net here, but we are definitely 10 to 15 feet above that, definitely more than that. Same for the corkscrew as well, but there will have to be some kind of netting structure here just to protect guests from flying objects naturally. We have this section here, which is a train length. So this will be our transfer track into some kind of maintenance bay, which we'll figure out when we're doing some more of the maintenance and construction things, which we'll do next. But before we jump into that, there's one other thing that ASTM kind of offers that could be a really interesting discussion, and that is the restraint class. There are 5 different restraint areas pertaining to how forceful your ride is. We're going to use this chart here, which again, that Coaster College video covers very nicely, but essentially you gather all of your G-forces onto this chart, and wherever it places tells you wherever area or class restraint you need. 5 obviously being the most restrained, which is most thrill coasters. And then area 1 is like literally like a merry-go-round, like literally no restraints. And then area 2 is where you're introduced to a lap bar, and so on and so forth. So if we look back at our G-forces, a max vertical G-force of 3.54 with a minimum of negative 1.08. So our max vertical G-force, which is this number here, is well above this. I'd be lying if I said that this makes a lot of sense to me. But if we look at the plus G's in the Z direction where you're being pushed downward into your seat, we have 3.54, which is obviously well above this. So, but negative G-forces, it seems like if you have anything really above 0, which we certainly do, you automatically fall into area 5. So this is an area 5 coaster, I believe, no matter what. If there's anybody in the comments that maybe understands this a little bit more than I do, let me know. But it looks like these vest restraints on the B&M wing are probably appropriate, which makes sense, I guess, because we have multiple inversions. Which, by the way, the length of the launch is decided by the acceleration rate and the max speed and the G-forces in between. Rapterra is 65 miles an hour. Ours is 54 miles an hour. Rapterra has about 215 foot launch. Ours is about 200 feet. So maybe a little bit of redundancy, which is okay. Better to definitely be redundant than anything. But this could probably be shortened reasonably. But technically this is code. Just probably a little wasteful with money. And that's pretty much most of the important code coming out of ASTM. I'm surprised at how little adjustments we had to make. I kind of nailed it first try with a lot of the layout, particularly the G-forces. I really expected myself to go way above because, as we know in past videos, my vertical G-forces are usually extremely excessive. But this guy seems to pass, so that's kind of nice. Another thing we will have to account for that accounts for a lot of the budget are all the ride features that go into every single track element. All these little pieces of electronics that go around, say, the launch or the brakes especially, and the station, are different kinds of sensors essentially detecting either the presence of the train. There are different ones that detect the speed of the train to make sure that the train is exactly where it needs to. I'm going to try my best to add these little kind of moments in the right areas to kind of add a little sense of realism. Another thing that we have pretty accounted for in this layout, but may be more relevant to another type of coaster, especially those that are swing launches or shuttles, are catwalks. Now, our catwalks make sense to have on the launch itself, as well as the break, and both are perfectly acceptable from the station. But say a moment like this with this huge valley here, if you have, say, a shuttle launch, this is a really good chance to put catwalks there, or even LSMs, to potentially swing launch it back up in the unfortunate case of a valley. Personally, I think of the Flash at Six Flags Great Adventure. I know that they have an LSM launch at the bottom of their little valley in case of the coaster not making it up. Again, that's not something that we're going to really have to mess with, but it is something that theoretically could be here. Now, the first thing we're going to do before we dive into the scenery, which I might do off camera, we have to actually do the queue. It actually is very similar to the breaks and the launch in that it needs a calculation to be done to actually figure out how much queue is needed. Now, if we go back to our brief, Dorney Park wanted 900 to 1200 riders per hour. That's their definition of high capacity and high throughput. Let's go for the lower number because that's the more extreme situation. So let's plan for that. Most parks want a queue line that is about 90 minutes to 120 minutes worth of holding guests. Let's say Dorney Park wants 90 minutes to be the maximum capacity of the queue line, which I think is relatively fair. Let's take 900 guests per hour and put it across 1.5 hours. That puts us at 1,350 guests per 90 minutes. If we times that by 4 square feet, which is the typical code for how much space one person needs, that puts us at 5,400 square feet of queue. If we take that 5,400 and we say our queue is about 4 feet wide, which is probably about fair, that puts us at 1,350 feet of queue length. So that's our number. That's how much actual queue length we need to have. That's why throughput and capacity are such a big deal, because if this ride does, say, 600 guests per hour, this line suddenly becomes very congested, guests become very upset, and all the fun things that come with that. Which more or less, if we look between these walls here, that's more or less what 102 meters or 1,350 feet of queue looks like. So relative to the size of the station and the launch track, you kind of get a glimpse at what a queue is supposed to look like. So that pretty much covers all the code and all the constraints that go into the layout. And I'm now going to assemble into an actual finalized product. So I'm going to do all of this off camera, and when we come back, you will actually see a finalized coaster that is as close to realistic as I think we can reasonably get in this game. So I definitely got some work cut out for me, so I'm going to go and do that, and I will see you when this is done. And then we'll talk about all the little details, ending the video with not only a cinematic and a POV, but also what an ROI looks like for this ride. Why does a theme park even do this in the first place? All that coming up soon. Alright everyone, welcome back to the final product. This is our final proposal for the theoretical addition to Dorney Park, and we've got a lot to cover. This is our attempt at building a realistic coaster, at least a realistic workflow in Planet Coaster, and there's a lot going on here. First, let me introduce you to the actual coaster itself. The coaster's name is Rustfall, kind of tying into Steel Force, which is adjacent and next door, and Iron Menace over there, kind of fitting the industrial theme that the Lehigh Valley, which is where this park is located, is famous for. All in all, with the scenery, I'm not going to touch on it too much because it's less about the scenery in this video, more about the actual roller coaster itself. But you just see some pretty basic theming, trying to keep it on the minimal side. Quickly, before we jump into the checklist on this coaster, let's talk about the station itself, which is of course a warehouse building. Not shocking to anybody there. We have 2 loading stations because it is a wing coaster. And then you see this kind of overpass, which is where the exits are for the guests. And they leave that way, exiting out this way, past the maintenance bay and everything, and out. Again, like I've been saying, this is less about the scenery. This is more about the actual realism of the coaster itself. So let's talk about the checklist that we have been talking about throughout the video. The first of which is ASTM guidelines. First, let's talk about the G-forces, which we already pretty much did the math on. We know we get a check mark there. We pass the G-forces. If we look at the stats here, we don't even have the most aggressive G-force stats in the world to begin with. But most importantly, as ASTM cares about, the transitions between heavy G-forces are very spread out. So that 200 millisecond window that we mentioned earlier, No problem there whatsoever. So G-forces look very good. Now clearances, and that's what this big white circle thing box is, and you can see some clipping happening here. This is actually a no. This coaster does not really pass anything regarding the clearances of the guest profile, or the envelope, I believe is what it was called. And this is a weird one because these are the in-game catwalks that come with the track style, and they are literally butt up right next to the guy all the way in the end. So he could very easily reach out and touch that if he wanted to. But really, the base game of Planet Coaster actually is not compliant in that way. So I actually wanted to note that. So technically, this is a no. But relative to the rest of the layout and the things I could more or less control, particularly this underground section here, it does actually pass. It's really only the catwalks there. If you take a look at that here, you can see there's a lot of clearance actually. This is a very big tunnel. I had to adjust this numerous times. Again, we're doing the 95th percentile of guest dimensions, which is more or less about the size of those circles that I added. All the netting that you're seeing and all the little subterranean and interactive moments with the terrain, they all pass and don't really... They are close, I will say, but they're all good. You can see that it clears any potential interactive moments there where the guests could get injured. Relative to path clearances, we are actually very good there. 10 feet or more was the request by ASTM for the clearances of the pathways and the guests to the coaster track, and you can see we're very good. Anywhere where the coaster interacts with the path, not only do we have that clearance, but we also have the proper netting. Even when the netting isn't on the path, the netting is elevated and follows the coaster track. Queue length, which we mentioned right before we jumped here, queue length is ideal. I believe it was about 200 meters worth of queue length, and we have squeezed it in. Here we have multiple cattle pens going on, as well as breaks in the fencing so that the guests can shortcut throughout the layout. So on a slow day, maybe they can allow this to be open and guests can immediately walk to the entrance rather than having to walk through all this. Compliant launch lengths, we already did the G-forces there. We are all good there. Not even 1 G of forward force is applied on this launch. Now that pretty much satisfies all the ASTM stuff, more or less, that we talked about. ADA, there's a lot that comes with ADA, making sure that people with disabilities can access the ride. We have a secondary queue, which is essentially the exit. You see this extension here. From the exit, we have a marked and labeled elevator, which takes the guests up here, and then they can access the front row or whatever row they would like through here. Now, in that regard, we are ADA compliant, but as I just mentioned, ADA is so thick. There's so many things that go into making sure something is ADA compliant. And then finally, the biggest one of them all, the budget. $20 million was asked of us by Dorney Park to build all of this. And the question is, does this fit in the $20 million budget? No, probably not. I'm not going to lie. I really overestimated, as most developers and designers do. I really overestimated just how big this plot of land is. Thankfully, it's pretty developed because the dinosaurs are alive, so there wouldn't be that much terraforming. But this is probably about 4 acres worth of coaster layout, and all this path and this little bit of theming is going to add up over time. And then for the actual coaster itself, we are at 2,776 feet of track, which is actually about 300 less than, say, Thunderbird at Holiday World or Rapterra at King's Dominion. Rapterra is 3,086 feet of track, and that was $30 million. Now, Thunderbird, which opened 10 years prior to Rapterra, has 3,035 feet, and that costs about $20 to $22 million, which has a dollar per foot of 7,248. So looking at those numbers, this actually would fit in our budget, but if we use the more inflated and realistic numbers of Rapterra, which is much closer to about $9,500 per foot of track, that brings us to a total, if we times that by our 2,776.9 feet of track on this coaster, that brings us to $26.3 million worth of work. Just for the sake of argument, that proves that the budget most likely would have been over by about $6 million. This concept would be invalid immediately, but it's alright. It was fun to do. One last thing before we head to the cinematic and the POV, of course, because I know you want to ride this coaster. It is a very fun layout. While we're here, let's talk about why a park even invests in a roller coaster, because they're not doing it for the love of the game, truthfully. They're doing it because there's a return on investment. They're looking to make a profit. So what does that actually look like? But generally, let's say this is a $20 million coaster. This coaster itself probably is, but let's say Dorney spent $20 million on a coaster. A realistic projection of a brand new premier attraction like this, like Iron Menace last year, or 2 years ago at Dorney Park, is about a 10% increase in your annual guests. Dorney Park, like we said at the very beginning of this episode, is in the tri-state area. It is in the heart of one of the busiest parts of the country, and because of that, it sees 1.5 million guests per year. A 10% increase of that is 150,000 new potential guests per year, which is just about $10 million of profit just from ticket sales. That's not even including all the other things that go into a guest day at a park. Think about that new level of profit that's coming in annually because of a premier attraction like this. Now, of course, the prestige burns out after a while, but let's say for the first 5 years, there is some prestige attached to this coaster. That's a lot of money. Now, of course, that's not all being pocketed by the park. You have to maintain and upkeep this coaster, which let's say is about 3 to 5% of the entire project cost, which we'll say is about $1 million per year. With upkeep being $1 million, you also have to staff the ride, and staffing the ride, let's say, is another $1 million a year, so that's $2 million already. Ride utilities, especially for a launch coaster, because launch mechanisms can be very troublesome, less so with LSMs, especially compared to, say, a cable launch or the old LAMs. Let's say ride utilities is maybe another $500K just on the conservative side. That's $2.5 million that has to be subtracted from that $10 million return. That puts you at $7.5 million. For $20 million and making about $7.5 million additional dollars per year from one premier attraction, that's only about 3 years to pay off what was a big investment. And that's why parks invest in these types of coasters. In 3 years, this ride will still be considered new. Iron Menace is just about to hit that 3-year mark, and it still feels new. And that's basically the video. I tried my best to make sure that I got a lot of my information right, because this is obviously not my forte. So I hope that those who do know what I'm talking about, I hope I did it justice. Keep an eye out for the next video on this channel, and no more will you be just staring at an overview of the entire coaster layout. Let's actually jump into the cinematic and the POV. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy.